I don't think it's for me to drone on for one whole hour. So it might be perhaps a better idea to make it more interactive. May I request that light over there to be switched off, because it's beamed straight into my eyes and I can't see anything as a result of this. So now, since I've been given a rather broad topic of Indian culture and civilization and an eternal journey, and you don't want me to speak for eternity, about a 6,000, 7,000 year old civilization, then what I may do is maybe have some introductory comments about framework of our history, and then we can maybe take it from there. So the question is, it must be reasonably well known that India is among the oldest civilizations in the world, going back to the early Bronze Age, even to the Neolithic Age, but certainly with a clear sense of a urbanized, in fact, civilization going back to at least 4,500 BC, at least. I'm saying at least because more and more archaeology suggests that the history may be significantly older than that. So the question now arises, what was the basis of this civilization, and how has our own understanding of this history changed over the last few centuries? Now, one of the interesting things is that India's own traditional understanding of history is that, if in our own religious texts, cultural texts, etc., is in terms of very vast spaces of time and of cycles of rise and fall of civilization. So if you read our ancient texts, it goes on about how there were these great kingdoms and cities and so on, and then something cataclysmic happens. It could be a war, or a river changes course, or something like that happens, and then that great age comes to a decline, and then after some time another great age arises. So it's a very cyclical view of history. Now, this view of history, however, changed in the 19th century under colonial occupation. Part of it was because of at that time, a Christian view that the world had really been started at 4000 BC with Adam and Eve, 4004 BC to be accurate, by Adam and Eve, and that was the beginning of history. Now that obviously changed in the 19th century, but by the time it percolated here, it's quite interesting that colonial era historians, for a variety of reasons, had already re-architectured the way we thought of our history, to come to the following view, that India essentially did not have a civilization till people called the Aryans came here from Central Asia and civilized us. Now, this is obviously a racist theory which fits with a certain kind of narrative, and then hopped across to Australia. So this is how humans moved. And then there was lots of migrations over thousands of years. About 20,000 years ago, there was a massive cooling of the planet, which we know as the Ice Age. And this pushed down people who had migrated further south. So there was another round of mixing, and of course the sea levels fell because there was lots of ice. And there were some very large rivers in northern India, which also dried up. So there was, northern India became sort of like a refuge for people being sucked down, as happened in Spain and Italy and so on. And then about 9,000 years ago, the world again warmed up, and again there were a bunch of migrations, but during this round there was between 9,000 BC and 7,000 BC, that's 9,000 years ago, and 6,000 BC, there was a huge amount of flooding along the coasts because of Ice Age came to an end. There was a series of floodings going back earlier, but there was this large big burst of flooding, which is one of the reasons that every large civilization in the world has a flood myth. You know the story of Noah. We also have one story of Matsya Avatar, which is very similar, about how the civilization was washed away and then there was a re-establishment of civilization. There's a story of Gilgamesh in the Middle East. There's a story, there are similar stories which the Australian Aboriginals had, and so on. And in this phase, our civilization then began sort of re-establishment of civilization began to happen in India, along a bunch of rivers, the most important of which, interestingly, is a river that we now remember as the Saraswati. Now, the Saraswati river now today does not exist. There's no river by this name alive today. But if you read our most ancient texts, it's full of this river called the Saraswati. In fact, it's so important that we today remember her as our goddess of learning and knowledge. But originally, when you read the oldest texts, she's not a goddess. She's worshipped as a goddess, but she's clearly a living river. Now, during the colonial period, much was said that either she was mythical or this river was somewhere in Central Asia. But of course, thanks to satellite photography, ground truthing and other things, we now have a very clear view of where this river existed. It existed in northwestern India, flowing out of the Himalayas through what is now the state of Haryana, not very far from here, by the way, out into what is now Pakistan and back into India in what is now called the Run of Kutch. You can Google this up. Run of Kutch are these huge salt flats in Gujarat, and they were the estuary of this river. So if you went there 6,000 years ago, this was the estuary of a river flowing out. And along this coastline, this course of this river, and on rivers on either side, the Indus on one side, these huge cities were created. We now know this civilization as the Saraswati Indus civilization, but they were scattered all over. At the same time, parallel civilizations also popped up along the Gangetic plain. So the Gangetic plain was not empty, as some people earlier believed. And there are these cities that grew and expanded. Some of these cities were huge cities. Some of them now in Pakistan. There's Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. But the biggest of them is not far from here. It's about 2-hour drive. There are new excavations happening in a place called Rakhigadi. It's a huge site. Few 100,000 people live there. These are not trivial sized urban settlements. For their time, they were by some margin the largest settlements in the world. And this river then made its way down into the Run of Kutch, which is in Gujarat. And we have lots of evidence of them trading, maritime trade, through to the Gulf area, where they were trading with the Sumerians, with people, a place called Dilmun, which is Bahrain, and the Omanis. And there's lots of trade going back and forth. And they produce these beautifully carved seals and so on, which are found in India, of course, but you find them also in Sumerian sites. And the Sumerians called these people the Meluha. Now, what do the Indian texts say about this evolution and understanding of this? Where our earliest texts are something called the Vedic texts, of which the oldest of them is called the Rig Veda. It's got 10 chapters. It's a fairly thick text. And this text is written in a very old form of Sanskrit, which is very different from later classical Sanskrit. My estimation is that this text dates back to about 4000 BC. 4000 to 3500 BC range. And it mentions very clearly this river called Saraswati all the time. But interestingly, it mentions a small tribe called the Bharatas. The Bharatas were a relatively small tribe who lived in just west of here, in the state of Haryana, along the Saraswati, and they called their homeland the Sapta Sindhu, or the Seven Rivers. Name of one of my books, by the way. And this name then spread to other places. We know, for example, the Sapta Sindhu, which was called by the Iranians Hapta Hindu, because the word Sa becomes her in ancient Iranian. So they called us the Hapta Hindu, and that's where the word Hindu comes from. And so we were the people of the Sapta Sindhu, 7 rivers, which were all tributaries of the Saraswati river. And this Bharata tribe, the earliest political event in our history that we know of, is that this Bharata tribe was attacked from the west by a coalition of 10 tribes, which attacked us, not us, this tribe called the Bharatas. And there was a battle in what is now would be in Pakistan, along a river called the Ravi, in which there was a grand battle in which the Bharatas defeated the 10 tribes and incorporated that part of the country into their homeland. And then they turned eastward and had a battle on the Yamuna and conquered what is now western Uttar Pradesh. So that is the earliest known sort of empire that that we know in Indian history, built by the Bharatas. Now they did something very interesting. Now, as you can imagine, historically, one tribe defeats another tribe. They impose their gods on that tribe because basically say, okay, my gods have beaten your gods, they must be stronger, so now you worship our gods. But the Bharatas instead did something very interesting. Instead of imposing their gods on other gods, they actually did a grand conference of some sort in which they invited all the priests and holy men, bards, singers, thinkers, whatever you may want to call them, of the defeated tribes and all the tribes that they had any contact with. So includes many tribes they had not defeated but were neighboring tribes. And in that they basically collected all the religious thinking, whatever were the philosophical thinkings, etc. of all these tribes and compiled them into what we now know as the Vedic compilation. It's a compilation, it's not one author. There are all these great poets and thinkers who are called the Rishis who contributed to this compilation. And so that's how you got a textual group called the Vedas. And it's quite interesting in the Vedas there's then a contract that all these tribes made, which is there in the very last chant of the Rig Veda, where basically they say, come together, sit together, let us be of one accord, let us all chant together. Let all our gods, let all our ancient gods have a place around the sacrificial fire. So essentially they created a space for all the gods, and the idea was we will recognize everybody else's gods. So that's why we ended up essentially creating the prototype on which Hinduism has subsequently ever since existed. But it also sets the wider context of Indic civilization as one of assimilation as opposed to imposition. And this idea was obviously a very powerful idea because it continued to spread. And so, over time, people of this subcontinent came to know themselves as the Bharatas, i.e. naming themselves after this relatively small tribe. So I come from far east of this country, I'm a Bengali. I'm clearly not from Haryana, as anybody knowing my surname will know. But I call myself a Bharata. Why do I call myself by the name of this tribe from Haryana, which is 1,500 kilometers west from where I am from? Because at some point in time, my ancestors signed up to this contract. So this is the basis of Indic civilization.
Sorry, what's the name?
Of the Bharatas. Yeah, this is, by the way, the official name of in Indian languages of India. If you read the India is in English word, we use it, of course, but Bharata is the official Indian language name of India. So even here you see it, any Indian, if you take up a constitution or a note, you see the Bharata written on it. The Bharata is our name for ourselves. Just like for the Chinese, the name for themselves is the Han. We call them Chinese. Yeah. So different countries, the Japanese have a similar thing. We call them Japan, but they call themselves Nihon or Nippon. So, and so on and so forth. So that's not an uncommon phenomenon. So the same thing is true of us. And I wanted to give you a sense of what this history is, because this is obviously a history which goes back, as I said, 6,000 years ago. Interestingly, in the middle of all of this, around 2000 BC, that's 4,000 years ago, the river on which this whole thing was based, called the Saraswati, dried up because of climate change. So when you look at India today, do remember that India is an old country which has been through many cycles of climate change. And when this climate change happened and this river Saraswati dried up, all the cities that I mentioned collapsed. And they were mostly abandoned, some population continued to live there but they became much more rural, or the settlements became much smaller. And there were massive migrations that happened as a result of what happened. Some of those people migrated westward. You begin to see people with Indian sounding names in the Middle East, like a tribe called the Mitanni, which fights wars with the Hittites and so on. You have similarly other places you have such migrations. There were, I'm sure, inward migrations as well. So there's a lot of mixing up happens. I'm making this point because you have to remember Indians are not an ethnic group. We come in every color you can imagine, every size, shape, etc. So Indic civilization is not based on ethnicity, it is based on civilization. So we are a civilizational nation, we are not a territorial nation, we are not an ethnic nation, we are a civilizational nation. Now of course, because we are dealing with vast scales of time, the geographical extent of this civilization has waxed and waned. The exact content of that civilization has waxed and waned. It has incorporated many things along the way, including many things of foreign origin. Indian civilization today would not be the same without adding in many things we now consider quintessentially Indian, including the English language in which I am speaking. It's a foreign imposition, but we have absorbed it. The cricket is a semi-religion in India, but it's obviously of foreign origin. Even the Hindu temple may be partly of Greek origin in its origins. The ancient Indians, which I mentioned, they were basically worshippers around a fire altar, and that's why the contract was about the gods around the fire altar. We still use the fire altar for formal occasions. For example, a wedding will be done around a fire, but the day-to-day worshipping is done in a temple. And where does the temple come from? There are no temples prior to our contacts with the Greeks. So, presumably we got it from or maybe somebody invented it, I don't know. But the point I'm making, it is obviously an evolving civilization that has absorbed all kinds of new ideas, some of them foreign ideas. Similarly, these ideas have spread outside India as well. So for a very long period of time, Indians would have considered Southeast Asia as within our civilizational ambit. And this is a very powerful idea because, again, the largest Hindu temple in the world is not in India, it's in Cambodia. You know it as Angkor Wat. And it is a reciprocated idea. Indonesia, when it becomes free from the Dutch in 1945 or 1949, depending on which date you prefer, they ended up calling themselves Indonesia. It's clearly named after India. Yeah. Their national currency is the rupiah, which is again the same name currency. Their national symbol is the Garuda, which is a particular depiction of an eagle, which is related to the god Vishnu, which is interesting because Indonesia is of course a Muslim majority country, but uses a clearly Hindu symbol as its national symbol. So what I'm trying to say is Indian civilization has existed for a very long time. It has evolved over long periods of time and absorbed all kinds of things. Its geographical extent has waxed and waned. But there has always been a very strong sense of us being Indian, which we have always remembered. And interestingly, other countries and other people who have traveled here have also commented on this from the beginning of time. So there are Chinese pilgrims or all kinds of other people, Greek travelers who have left their comments. Now, interestingly again, and why decolonization is an important issue, colonial period historians insisted that this sort of idea of civilization simply did not exist. This is interesting because they themselves, in the very beginning, before they had colonized India, themselves used to accept that India was a continuing and ancient civilization. But having conquered India by the middle of the 19th century, they began to propose the idea that there never was anything called India. Now this is quite interesting. So colonial era historiography would come up with something like, for example, there's a very famous quote by Winston Churchill, who by the way is not a hero in this country, but seen as a mass murderer. It comes up and he says that there never was an India, and that India is no more a united nation than the equator. Now obviously that why they would want to do it is obvious. They were occupying a country and illegally, and so they wanted to spread the thing, we just taken over a place that was kind of empty. There were some people there, but doesn't matter. We are the people who gave this place civilization. We gave it bureaucracy. I have no idea why anybody is proud of the Indian bureaucracy, but anyway. And we gave the laws and so on and so forth. So the point here is there has been this old story, which we of course are now beginning to clearly, now systematically decolonize. I'm about to end here to open it to questions, You may ask why it required 75 years before we began doing this. It's only relatively recent where we have begun to tell our own stories. And this must have happened in Africa too. What happened is the following. At the time when we became independent, there was obviously a lot of confusion. There was partition, the Second World War had just ended, there was lots of confusion in the world in general. There were a large number of Indian principalities which had to be absorbed together and so on. So in the middle of that, essentially, we did not do what we should have done then, which is to purge India of the collaborators. Because do remember that the British ruled India through a class of collaborationist Indians who ruled India largely on their behalf. I mean, at any point in time, there were no more than 250,000 British living in India, including the army, maybe 150,000 or so of them. So there was always a large collaborationist class which signed up to British rule. Now, after independence, it's interesting, it is not those who fought for independence who ended up in power. A very large section of those who ended up in power after independence were actually those who had been collaborators, because they were the administrators, educators, and other people in positions of power. And so the first and second generation of India's intellectual class was ironically people who had collaborated with the British. And there's more than adequate evidence of this. And so what happened is this class, of course, needed to justify that they were not they had not been collaborating with anybody, because after all India didn't exist. So ironically, this colonial story was actually perpetuated and strengthened after independence by the collaborationist class. And it has happened in many African countries where the Africans who continued afterwards were actually the people who were very happily living before that, collaborating with the occupying power. So it is only relatively recently that a new class of educated Indians have turned up and begun to finally question this narrative that is being done. So it will surprise you that India became independent in 1947. The first Indian to become the chief of the Indian Navy was in 1958, 11 years after becoming independent. We still had a British naval chief. Even today, we are still paying there are still some British colonial era officers in Britain whose pensions the government of India still pays. So this is a very interesting turn of events of why the re-establishment and decolonization of the way we think of ourselves is absolutely important. Otherwise, these deliberately skewed views end up messing with your head in very real ways. And of course, it can pop up in serious things. I mean, what happened in Rwanda, for example, between the Hutus and Tutsis, is a great example of what happens when a colonial era narrative is pumped through, leading to really disastrous outcomes. Of course, later on, the Catholic Church did apologize for it, but I'm just pointing out to you that these are not harmless things. And it is not even good for those who did the appropriation. Because after all, the appropriation of Indic symbols and ideas by the Germans in the 19th century led to Nazism. Right? Now the word Arya means something totally different in the Indian context. It just means noble or civilized. It does not have any racial context. Anybody can be from any race and be civilized as Arya. But it was given a racial context by the Nazis, and it turned out to be a bad thing for the Germans themselves. So I'm just pointing out to you, it's not just bad for us, it's bad for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for this valuable session. I think everything that you have shared today is new information to each one of us. So thanks a lot. If in case you have any questions, then you may address it to me, sir.